Imagine you're 10 years old. You're sitting in class trying to focus, but your stomach is in knots. You didn't sleep well last night because your parents were arguing and fighting again. You're not thinking about the previous lessons in class from days before or even weeks before. Instead, you're wondering whether it's safe to go back home. Hi, my name is Khyon Bailey, but everyone just calls me Kai. Today, I want to talk about something that affects millions of children and adults, often in silence: the effects of stress and trauma on learning and memory. This talk is personal and it hits close to home for me. I've worked in education with young children and grew up around a host of family members, friends throughout all stages of development. I've seen students, friends, and family all struggle with learning, and not because they weren't smart, but because their brains were prioritizing survival mode over study. Stress and trauma are not just emotional, they're biological events that reshape how the brain functions, especially in children and adolescents whose brains are still developing. When we experience acute stress or ongoing trauma, our body activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, also known as the HPA axis, which floods us with cortisol and stress hormone. In short bursts, cortisol helps us to focus and react. But when stress is chronic, it starts to damage the very brain systems we rely on when learning. This can lead to a feeling of mental block that causes difficulties when trying to focus in the classroom environment. Here's what we know from neuroscience. Hippocampus is the brain center for learning and memory formation. Chronic stress can shrink this structure, which makes it hard to form new memories or even recall older ones. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive function, attention planning, and impulse control. Trauma reduces activity here, impairing focus and decision making. The amygdala is known as the brain's alarm system. In trauma survivors, the amygdala becomes hyperactive and begins scanning constantly for danger. This leads to hypervigilance and distractibility. Neurotransmitters like glutamate and dopamine are disrupted. Glutamate is essential for learning, and it becomes neurotic in excess. Dopamine is linked to motivation and reward and becomes dysregulated eventually, leading to apathy or anxiety. A study in the brain to body response to chronic stress found that students exposed to chronic stress like poverty, abuse, or neglect often showed reduced hippocampal volume and poorer memory performance. When in educational settings, another study from Rise magazine showed that toxic stress in early life alters the brain's architecture, especially in children under the ages of 5 years old. Toxic stress literally rewires their brains for survival instead of curiosity and growth. Functional MRI scans of trauma affected youth show reduced connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala. This means that the thinking brain struggles to regulate the feeling brain. Knowing about the effects of toxic stress on the thinking brain and how it affects the feeling brain, we must act ethically and effectively. Trauma-informed education classrooms must be able to recognize that disruptive behavior may be a neurobiological response to trauma, not specifically willful disobedience. Strategies to help students navigate through trauma include predictable routines, emotion regulation techniques, and placing them in safe relational environments. SEL practices like mindfulness, breathing exercises, and yoga have been shown to reduce cortisol and increase prefrontal cortex activity, improving attention and memory. Previous psychological science study shows that mindfulness improves working memory and emotional regulation in traumatized youth. Early intervention programs like Head Start or trauma-informed therapy can partially reverse psychological damage if provided early. Neuroplasticity means healing is possible, especially in children. The brain's ability to change should be used and manipulated as a positive impact instead of a negativity that comes along with trauma and stress. We must be careful when labeling students as traumatized, as this can lead to stigma from a lack of understanding. Trauma-informed care should support without pathologizing. Neurodivergent individuals, such as those with ADHD or ASD, may respond differently to stress, so more of a one-size-fits-all approach can harm more than help. Much of the brain research is correlational, not causal. We must avoid trying to oversimplify the narrative that trauma equals brain damage. We need holistic, ethical, and inclusive models of education and healthcare that integrate both neuroscience and humanity together. We now know that the brain isn't a passive sponge for knowledge. It's a sensitive living system that changes based on experience, whether for better or worse. If we want to close learning gaps, reduce mental health crises, and help others thrive, we must stop asking, "What's wrong with you?" and start asking, "What happened to you?" And how can we help your brain heal? Because in the end, learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a brain that feels safe, seen, and supported, both mentally and emotionally. Thank you.